Good morning, good evening, and good night to you all, and thank you for tuning in. And the screen opposite, as you can see, is Brother Mel, who we did an advert for the show a couple of days back. I think it was just yesterday, actually, wasn't it? Or 2 days ago.
It feels like yesterday. Yeah,
it feels like yesterday. In which we said we were going to discuss his thesis, in which he basically he's drawing out the problem of the history of Islam, where the evidence that is on the ground from the time and just prior to doesn't seem to line up with the narrative of the birth of Islam that developed 2 centuries after the Hijra. And we're going to go into that in more detail and discuss his thesis. I'm doing it from a friendly but skeptical perspective, I think is the fairest way to say. We'll start, as we always do, by reading a psalm, but in this case, I'm going to let Mel read that for us. So take it away, Mel.
Absolutely. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in an idol or swear by a false god. They will receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from God their Saviour. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. Amen.
Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
So, Mel, just to start off with then, if you could start off by just giving us the conclusion first, and then what we're going to do is we're going to unpack the reasons why you came to that conclusion. And then that way we know where we're going. So what is the conclusion of your argument?
So the conclusion is simply that the Islamic tradition is ahistorical. And what I mean by that is that a large part of it is not historically correct, which leads us to a conclusion that it's unreliable as a source of the history of Islam, and particularly the origins of Islam. And so today my aim is to look at contemporary evidence. I'm also going to look at the religious context in which the religion arose. And what I'm going to suggest is the evidence contradicts that Islamic tradition. And there is a more natural explanation. We don't have to accept the spiritual or divine explanation that Islam offers for the beginning of Islam. I believe that when you're trying to understand something, you start with a natural explanation. And it's only when you exhaust the natural explanation can you then turn to a divine or spiritual explanation. That's a more logical way to go about things. So that's my sort of take on it.
Okay. And so to be clear then, what you're not proposing is some kind of alternate theory of history, like, for instance, Robert Spencer, who argues Muhammad never existed. What you're arguing is simply not that you're offering an alternative story, but simply you're saying that the story that we've got doesn't correspond to the evidence. Is that? Am I summarizing it correctly?
Essentially, yes. My goal today isn't necessarily to present an alternative chain of events necessarily. What I'm mainly focused on is the fact that what we can establish contradicts many points of the Islamic tradition. Now, there are many ways of responding to those bare facts. And, different scholars have proposed different ways of explaining those basic facts. I have my own ideas, at least with some of those points. But I think the ultimate goal is to, first of all, recognize that the facts don't match up with the Islamic tradition. There are some echoes of the truth in that Islamic tradition. So I'm not taking a completely radical point of view on this, but I am leaning towards the idea that there's fundamental flaws in that Islamic tradition, to a point where I would not be happy in using the Islamic tradition to establish a point of history. I would need to see contemporary evidence, things like documentary evidence, numismatics, and rock inscriptions and things of that nature to be confident in what I'm being presented as history. And also, it's very helpful to have sources which are not from the Islamic tradition, so they don't have, I would say, as best as possible, they don't have a propaganda that they're trying to propose. And that's quite difficult. So even with the non-Islamic sources, you still have to critique those as well and make sure that they are neutral as best you can.
Or rather, that they have contrasting propaganda. So one thinks, for example, of the example of Praxeus, or was it, no, Contra Celsus by Tertullian. So he's quoting Celsus, and Celsus isn't denying that Christ was a miracle worker. He's saying that he learnt magic in Egypt. You know, he didn't deny that that there was a claim that there was a virgin birth. He was saying that actually the whole story of the virgin birth emerged from the fact that a illegitimate child of a Roman soldier was born. And so by this sort of overlap of contrasting narratives, we identify a kernel of indisputable truth, where everyone seems to agree. So everyone seems to agree that Joseph wasn't the biological father of our Lord, and everyone seems to agree that Christ performed miracles. No one disputes those things. It's just the reasons. You know, is that that's kind of
that's pretty much it. I tend to follow Robert Hoyland's criteria in terms of appraising those sources. So one of the things that he looks for is that there isn't an obvious polemic going on. And that's usually where there is a simple journalistic type of retelling of key events. Nothing too expanded, just very concise to the point. And then another thing would be early sources tend to be better than later sources. They're not always more reliable, but typically they're more reliable the earlier they are. And then if you have a convergence of a number of independent sources from different geographical areas, ideally from different points of view, all saying the same essential thing, to me that strengthens the case rather than just one point of view at one particular time.
No, exactly. And I think that the moment you get into hadiths, that you fall foul of this idea that there's polemical points being made. You know, the hadiths were often guided by who was the ruler of the time, and so some hadiths were used to legitimize one ruling caliphate system, and then some hadiths were created to delegitimize the other one. So I think, was it the Umayyads who delegitimized Ali, or not Ali, but you know, they were Abbasids and the Umayyads, wasn't they?
That's right, yeah.
This whole kernel of ferocious interreligious and political dynamism meant that whole hadiths were spuriously created to put words into Muhammad's mouth to back one side or the other. So what would you say are the main planks then of your argument? What are the main planks upon which your argument rests?
Well, the first thing is there is a substantial amount of evidence that there is a sect that pre-exists Islam, which accounts for a good part of Islam's origins, which I'm going to propose is Abrahamism. And there's historical records of that going back many centuries. The other plank of this, in terms of the religious context, is that we can see clearly where Islam has picked up ideas and practices from other religions. So my starting point today will be just to point out, okay, this is a belief or this is a practice, and this is where it's come from. And so that's a natural explanation, so that we see a natural development of a new religion in baby steps. So what I'm not suggesting are some giant leaps in a short period of time. I'm suggesting that Islam gradually developed in very small baby steps over a long period of time. And if you were alive at the time, you wouldn't notice those baby steps because it was just one little thing at a time. And then every new generation just knew their time. They didn't know much about what happened prior to that. So in most cases, I would say there isn't a nefarious reason for the changes. A lot of the
It's
time,
not like a grand. So you're not arguing like a grand conspiracy or
no,
some central hub of coordination in this conspiracy. You're not saying any of that. You're saying it's kind of an
no.
organic evolution.
It's predominantly it's kind of a mixed bag, but it's predominantly a decentralized movement. There are some elements which I'll point out as we go through our talk today and our discussion. There are some elements of centralized hadith making on the orders of caliphs, but that isn't typical of all of what went on. And typically, if it had only been that, I think it would show up in the history much more clearly that it was a conspiracy, and that's why we don't see obvious signs of conspiracy, because it wasn't just caliphs ordering this to happen.
Yeah, totally. No, I think when you're governing an empire, when you freshly conquered other people's lands and you freshly occupied other people's lands, to suddenly govern that, you can't radically change it overnight. The infrastructure, there's this whole bunch of legalism that you end up remolding and recasting, and within that you'll absorb little bits and cut other little bits out and modify little bits over there, and you see that as a natural.
There's an anthropological explanation for the evolution which is often ignored, and it's just simply that where you have different cultures intermingling, they exchange ideas, and it's natural. It's natural for a group of people to absorb the ideas, particularly of the people that joined the group. And this happened in the early days of Christianity. As Christianity expanded, the peoples who joined Christianity brought their ideas. Like, for example, the Romans brought their ideas of what a church should look like. And so you have exactly the same thing. So it's not anything bizarre that I'm proposing today. It's actually very logical.
And we're not embarrassed by that
not at all,
cultural interconnection.
No.
Christians have been open about their dialogue with Greek philosophy from the time of the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers were very conscious of the fact that they were engaging with the Greco philosophical world. That's why Tertullian said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" Because he was one of those Church Fathers that kicked against the general direction of all the other Church Fathers.
I would say. I would just say that I think with any. Oh yeah, sorry.
It's just I'll let you come back to your point. But I got 2 points. I got two of your planks. One is Abrahamism. The other one is the absorption of beliefs and practices from the surrounding cultures. Is that the cultures that they conquered, or the ones in Arabia?
It's both. So
both.
It starts off. It's the
what's your third plank? Sorry, I just want to get all your planks out first, and then
So the third plank is the role of Abdul al-Malik and his general al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Who was the governor of Iraq, and they played a crucial role in terms of creating the propaganda of a state religion. And so they had a crucial role in announcing Muhammad to the world, and basically popularizing his story among the people. And the details of the religion, like, for example, the religious practice in mosques and so on, seem to start from their time. So I'm going to give you evidence of signs in history that show you that what we don't see before their time, we suddenly start seeing it from their time onwards, which suggests that they had a big part in the establishment of Islam. And this isn't totally against the Islamic tradition, because as I'll show you, there are elements of the Islamic tradition that acknowledge that fact, their key role in how Islam began. So it is a complete contradiction of the Islamic tradition.
I mean, and that creates a tension, doesn't it, between the fact that before that you had jurisprudence that was based upon existing legal systems, and then kind of later on, then you get this sudden use of hadiths, and it's kind of like, well, why wasn't this there from the beginning? Why is it they were just making these legal analogies to make legal judgments, and then all of a sudden there's this change in terms of how legal fiqh is used and fatwas are given.
So basically they had laws in place from the earlier times, and they needed
from the Roman, the Zoroastrian,
exactly, and they needed to religionize it or Islamize those by just saying, well, Muhammad had originally said this or did this, and that's the reason for this particular law. And that was a large part of the reason for many of the hadiths. And they picked up this practice from the Jews in Iraq. That was their way of creating law. They had oral law and written law, and they used case studies essentially to decide on particular matters.
Sure. Any other planks to your argument? We've got Abrahamism. We've got the absorption of practice, doctrine, and belief values from other cultures before and after conquest, and then a particular al-Muwawi as a key figure in the process. Any other planks?
Another big plank would be the Abbasid revolution. So the large part of the reason why we don't have much memory of the early days of Islam is basically the Abbasids destroyed the Umayyads and destroyed their history. So they got rid of everything to do with the Umayyads. They even desecrated their bodies. They dug them out of the ground and crucified the old caliphs. And they did everything. So they did everything they could possibly do to delete them from history. So when they took over, then there was a change in direction. So the Islam that they basically formed is the Islam that we know today.
Yeah.
So basically, the Islam of the Umayyads was a much more benign Islam than the later one under the Abbasids. There was a definite move towards the sort of Islam that you see in Surah 9, that sort of violent, aggressive attitude. The Umayyads were actually persuaded.
The Umayyads did invade other people's lands. Let's never forget that.
Oh no!
Let's never forget that they invaded other people's lands.
They certainly did, but it's just a matter of degree. There is certain evidence that the Umayyads didn't push the conversion of people as strongly as the Abbasids did. So the Umayyads were willing to tolerate paganism right at their doorstep, whereas the Abbasids were not willing to tolerate that. But even towards, say, the midway point of the Umayyads, they were beginning to head in that direction as well, I should point out. So it's not as black and white as I'm presenting it.
And the Umayyads, how long after Hijra were they?
Well, the Umayyads were from Muawiya, which would be 661, and all the way from there to 750 roughly is the Umayyad period. So you're talking about 90 years in total. So from 30 AH roughly to I'm not good with maths, but it's I think 120 AH or something.
Okay.
Something like that.
So any other planks to your argument? Abrahamism, the absorption of cultures, beliefs, doctrines, teachings, al-Muwawi, and the Umayyads.
Yeah, and the Umayyads, and Abbasids.
The Abbasid revolution. Sorry, that's what you said. And then the fifth point. Is there a fifth point? Or is that...
There is a fifth point. Is the Syrian connection. So I'm going to be talking about how a large part of where the Quran got its material from was from this Syriac tradition, which is perfectly Christian tradition, which was mixed with the Abrahamist sect. And so basically the process of creating the Quran was a process of dialogue, if you like, between those different strands of Arab culture. And I'm going to give you evidence for that later.
Okay. So we've got a lot to get through then. And we've got a maximum of an hour and 35 minutes to get through it all. So I suppose we need to start digging into the argument now that we've laid it out. I forgot my manners. I forgot to check and say hello to people. I do apologize if I missed anyone's greetings. Can I just check with everybody? Can you put a 1 or a 2? 1 for yes and 2 for no. Can everyone hear us fine? I'm guessing so because I wasn't looking at the comments. So, but I probably guess that everyone can hear us because I've not seen any people putting any comments saying we can't hear you. Yep, 1 1 1 2 had to. Okay. 2 a.m. Sorry, poor timing. Villainous. Okay, 1 1 1. So we're all good. So then, Mel, give us the evidence for your first argument, and I'm going to be acting as curator. So if I think you're making a spurious link, I'm going to try and jump on you.
you'll forgive me in terms of my first argument was what? Just remind me, which one did I start with?
Abrahamism.
Okay, so my evidence for Abrahamism, I'm going to first of all, to set the scene, to set the context, is I'm going to just survey the religious sects of the time and zero in on Abrahamism.
Sure,
so that
that's fine. I just want to bear you in mind that I've got a lot to get through, so just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and be as quick as I can. So first of all, there are a lot of sects in Arabia, and I'm particularly going to be focusing on North Arabia, and there's a lot of evidence for that. I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but I could if I had more time, I would. So paganism was definitely prevalent up to the mid-century. We know that from Yehuda Nevo's survey of the Negev. There were various Judeo-Christian sects. There were Samaritans, rabbinical Jews. But one particular one, which is very important, is Abrahamism. And I'm going to quote very quickly from Yehuda Nevo's book to give you an idea what their sect was about. In several sources, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, we find evidence that throughout the 1st century CE, there existed a form of monotheism which emphasized Abraham as founder of the religion, an exemplary model. Many of these sources have been discussed by Pines, on whose work we largely rely on the following account. The earliest is Tertullian, 160 to 230 CE, who disputes with a group who want to follow the example of Abraham. He tries to convince them of the error of their ways by asking if they propose, therefore, to practice bigamy and circumcision. Pines considers that these Abrahamists probably lived in the 2nd century. Later on, there is Zosiminus, who lived in Gaza and seems to have had considerable knowledge of the Arab tribes. In his ecclesiastical history, written 443 to 450, he describes a form of Ishmaelite monotheism, which he considers to be identical to the pre-Mosaic religion of the Hebrews. The Ishmaelites' present religion, he concludes, is a corruption of that monotheism due to the influence of their pagan neighbors over long periods of time. Zosiminus further relates that some of the Arabs who had thus fallen from the purity of their original religion into pagan ways learnt more recently from the Jews of their descent from Abraham, and consequently adopted Jewish laws and customs, so that many among them have a Jewish way of life. Finally, they have now also begun to adopt Christianity as a result of coming into contact with priests and monks. Sabius, the Armenian historian writing in the 2nd half of the 1st century of Islam, has a similar account of the Arabs learning of their descent from Abraham from the Jews. So what we see there are the essential details of Islam. There's a Jewish influence, there's a Christian element, but in this sect, they do not believe that Jesus is divine. They refer to him merely as a servant of Allah in their language. And what I'm proposing is that simply this sect was developed into what became known as Islam. And the key addition to that sect was Muhammad as a prophet.
So when you say that there's a group, now firstly, I can well believe that the penetration of Christianity from Ethiopia, the penetration of Judaism within the Arabian Peninsula will have affected that culture, so that it would have created a milieu in which other kinds of monotheism could be born. I'm not so sure that we can link that monotheistic culture, which probably was emerging within the Arabian Peninsula, because obviously paganism always gives way to monotheism. It's just the natural order of things. These beliefs could be linked back to the group that Tertullian was engaging with necessarily. I'm not so sure that these things could be linked, but you could see how these things could influence, and how the Jewish people could have influenced the identity of the Arabian people, in teaching them about their history. So I don't think your point is particularly contentious, if I may say. I think
we will see evidence as a carry on. I'm going to give you some.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what evidence have you got of was this Abraham group organized? Did they have like a structure like the church, or structure like the Jewish rabbinical tradition or the Samaritans? Did they have a structure, or was it a loose confederacy of belief?
The exact details of it, I'm not au fait enough to give you a definite, but it was very similar to the Jewish way of life. I would suggest that, as Patricia Crona and Neville would suggest, they're very similar to Samaritanism of the time. They did pray in a particular direction, which was a practice that both the Jews and the Samaritans did. They did meet together to pray, and they had various other rituals like circumcision and so on. But the evidence that I'm going to present later is the fact that we find the language of the Abrahamists on the rock inscriptions predominantly in Arabia. There are some, and very specifically the reference to Abraham. We also find that Umayyad, in writing to the emperor of the time, whose name escapes me, actually calls him to worship the God of Abraham in particular, which is a sign that he himself was an Abrahamist. So that's.
I mean, so that's something that we'll get into. But what else about this? Because so far, I mean, what you're hearing is indisputable. We know that there were different religious groups. We know that pagans were there. We know Samaritans were there. We know there were Jews. We know there were Christians. And we can assume that these groups would have all sort of mixed, and thus they would have created a substrata in which there was people that were infused and influenced by all of them. And I think that there is evidence that within sort of like early Dark Ages kind of Arabia, that there was an emerging sense of monotheism within the culture, and poets and other mystics sort of believing in the one God, but giving them the name Allah, which obviously isn't unique to Islam.
What Yehuda Nevo says about the whole situation is that monotheism was typically that of the elite. That was a religious point of the elite, whereas the popular belief among the masses of Arabs was still paganism. And so there was a period of transition from predominantly paganism in Arabia to one of monotheism. It didn't happen overnight.
Yeah, totally.
And so there was a kind of a conflict, and we kind of see that in the argument about the direction of the Qiblas, which I'm not going to go into, but that might reflect some of that tension between a leadership that wants to go monotheistic and a populace that wants to stay pagan. And the reason why the Arab leaders might have wanted to go monotheistic might have been because they want to be part of the club of monotheists worldwide. You know, they were dealing with the Byzantians. It may be a far-fetched point, but it certainly gave them a higher status when dealing with the Byzantians with that sort of belief.
Focusing in more on the Abrahamism, what else have you got to say about that before we move on to the next point, or are we just acknowledging that they're there?
We're just acknowledging it. I have looked at all the different sects. There's about 13 different sects, and I'm not going to go into them in great detail. But the one that stood out was Abrahamism. There are suggestions of a Judeo-Christian sect that Islam might have grown out of, which would predicate that they were basically Jews that took on Christian beliefs, essentially. But I think the Abrahamist one has got a stronger basis to it, considering the history that goes back and how the Arabs considered it their religion, essentially, because it gave them a reason to believe that they originated from a great man called Abraham. And who came from Ur, which is in Mesopotamia, so they felt as if they were connected to that guy.
Yeah, I think it strikes me that, I mean, the term Abrahamism, it sounds like a later term, a bit like Hindu is a later term that ended up being applied by the colonialists to the people in the Hindus, and in that part of the world, and then was adopted later. Where this strikes me as Abrahamism strikes me as a term that is given as a way of categorizing
just breaking up there.
Yeah, sorry. What was the last thing you heard?
You're just
Hello?
breaking up there.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, to answer your point, which I think you were saying that it sounds like it's a later name placed on that sect. And it probably is.
So my
I'm
point
not sure.
is, yeah, I think what kind of evidence have we got of this monotheism? I mean, I believe that it was there. I've read about it myself when I studied religion, but I'm asking you because this is your argument. What evidence have we got?
Breaking up again. What? Sorry, it broke up. Are you asking me what evidence was there of monotheism in Arabia?
What evidence have we got of an emerging monotheism?
It is in terms of the rock inscriptions primarily. So if we go back, say, to, let's say, 100 AD.
Right, so let's dig into the rock inscriptions then.
Okay, so predominantly the rock inscriptions would have been primarily in reference to Aluza and Alat and so on in pagan times. So in the first century of Islam, what you find is you have Abrahamist type rock inscriptions, and then gradually a development into Islamist ones. For this part, I would like to share a PowerPoint with you. Is that all right? Just to give you some examples of those inscriptions, or do we have time?
Yeah, we do, but I just want to I know that StreamYard, when people are sharing their screens, it can sometimes make it a bit unstable. So we may have to abandon this if it doesn't. But
okay, we'll see. We'll just see. No. Okay. No, unfortunately, not if I can.
There should be a tab at the bottom saying share screen.
Share screen, yeah. Okay.
I mean, if you can't, you'll just have to talk us through it.
Yeah. Are you able to see my PowerPoint at the minute?
Nope, I cannot see your PowerPoint. Let me just hold on. Let me just maybe it's something I need to do. 1 second. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. I think I haven't.
Share your screen now. Share your screen now.
Yeah.
Have you shared your screen?
I think that's. It should have. Let me just share audio.
Do you see the tab at the bottom that says share screen? Do you have that on your side?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, let me just try it again. Okay, sure. No, I think you should be sharing now. 1 second. Is that any good? No?
Nope, that's not working.
No. Well, in any case, what I'll do is I'll just refer to it just to save us time. So essentially, Yehuda Nevo went through 4 different basic texts that are found in the rock inscriptions. So the basic texts up to the year 704, these were typically indeterminate, monotheistic, mostly undated. And then there was a subgroup which were classified as Judeo-Christian, right? And let me just give typical feature.
Yeah, go on. I think it is. Yeah, go on.
A typical feature of them would be a request for forgiveness for someone, and sometimes it would ask for lasting forgiveness or forgiveness for future sins. And expressions like Abdul Allah and Amir al-Mumin were general expressions that could be polytheistic or monotheistic, so they were very general.
Yeah, because Allah was a pagan god.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so during this period, all the way up in the popular inscriptions up to the year 704, there are no references to Muhammad. There's no references to Ba'ath, which is the Arabic word for resurrection, or Hazar, which is a reference to the Last Judgment. And let me just very quickly give you some examples. Forgive, Lord of Musa. So that's a typical Abrahamist phrase. Another one is forgive, Lord of Isa and Musa. So the use of the word Isa is actually found on those rock inscriptions. So that shows you that it's not from a Christian sect, but it's from one that is using different terminology. Another one is forgive. Sorry.
Well, I'm just saying, like what it says to me is that there's obviously that could be Christian, it could be Jewish, could be Christians using possibly an Arabized form of Christ's name. I mean, why could it be those?
Well, simply because we have records from the Christian groups, and they use Yeshua. That was their typical word for Jesus. It was in these sects that we find the use of Isa. So there was distinct vocabulary used for each group, and so that alone was very distinctive.
And you would imagine that if these were Muslim texts, that they would put Muhammad's name there as well.
Yeah, and there's no reference
if they can
to
type
Muhammad.
Musa, they can type Isa. They can scribe out Muhammad, couldn't they?
Yeah, and so there's certain phrases that you find in them as well, like Amin Rab al Amin, which you find in the Quran. So there are elements there which you could say that okay, they look Quranic, but they're never in the context of a reference to Muhammad. If I can give you another one, just very quickly, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful Allah, forgive so-and-so his transgressions, the early ones and the later. Verily, you are the omniscient, the mighty judge. Amen. Now, if you were looking at that from through Islamic lens, you might think, well, that's Islamic, but there's no reference to Muhammad until much later.
But why would there need to be?
So the next period...
Hold on a minute. I want to pause you on that. I want to pause you there a couple of it.
Yeah.
Firstly, the datings that you've given. How can we say that these inscriptions are from such and such a date? Where's that date coming from?
Usually, the method that Nevo talks about is you have some of the inscriptions are dated very clearly, and
as in they write the date in.
They literally write how many years since. They sometimes would use AH, and sometimes they use alternative dating, but you have at that time. People didn't just graffiti on rocks. You actually hired someone to do your rock inscription. These were people who had the skills. And so typically where you have one rock inscription by, let's say, Ahmed something or other's name, who's the inscriber, he will always write his name in the inscription to say that he's the one who's done it. And so if you have one rock inscription with his name, and you find others that are not dated, but with his name in the same area, it's fair to date in the same period as this inscriber. That's how we can frame those in the same period, even though the undated ones obviously are vague, but it's a broad time frame for them. But it's based on the idea that other inscriptions are by the same inscriber.
So these dates that you gave, the ones that mention Musa and Isa, I heard a date. Did you say 704 up to 704?
I think I said 708.
708. So that's quite a bit into the official story about the birth of Islam. Because by this time, if I remember correctly, Islam is born. Islam is now pushing outwards. By 704.
It took a long time. It took a long time, really, for Islam to become popular among the ordinary people.
But that's your point, isn't it?
Yeah,
Mel,
that's exactly my point.
Yeah, that is your point, because you're saying that if the official narrative is that Islam dominated the Arabian Peninsula, conquered these other lands, and then Islamified them over time, but it had controlled Arabia. But if these inscriptions are anything to go by, it would imply that actually there were other religious groups living within the Arabian Peninsula around Mecca and Medina that didn't have that belief.
Yeah. Like Nevo actually points out there were 50 pagan sites built in the Negev, which is right next to Petra, that desert between Egypt and Arabia. 50 of them built up to the year 750 AD. So they were carrying on as per usual, as if nothing was happening,
Yeah.
And it was only the Abbasids that ended up destroying them.
Well, I mean, the cultural vandalism there is not something that we can get too high on uppity about, because Christians have done that as well. But at the same time, it shouldn't be ignored either for the sake of it. So go on.
So just moving on very quickly. So the next time frame that he gives is 730 to 736. Okay, so this is literally 100 years into Islam's origins, apparently, according to Islamic tradition. And this is when you get the first mention of Muhammad in the text. But what you don't find is much in terms of Islamic theology. It's just very basic reference to him. And I'll just give you let me see if I can give you a quick example with Muhammad's name mentioned. Let me just see. Okay, so nice quick one. Amen, Lord of Muhammad and Abraham. And this is dated to 736. So that's essentially, you can see that the connection with Abraham as well there. Another one is Allah, incline unto Muhammad the Prophet, and unto him who prays for him. And Tuwaba bin Maruf wrote it, so that's the inscriber. And he asked Allah for Al-Jannah by his love, which I believe is heaven. Now, what's also something I didn't say is in the basic text, that first period, there isn't any signs of belief in the afterlife, which is unusual. It tends to be just references just to the here and now, whereas in the Mohammedan period from, say, 730 onwards, there seems to be now a belief in the afterlife and in Muhammad.
And where are these inscriptions found? Sorry, what area of the world are we talking about?
So these are primarily in the Negev, and then some of them are also found near Damascus. So it's quite it's northwest of Arabia, and that's simply because these are ones that Yehuda Nevo personally went to and recorded.
I
have looked into.
Go on.
I have looked into the inscriptions of Dr. Ahmad Al-Jalad, who's the world expert in rock inscriptions, and to this date I have not found any examples of references to Muhammad in the popular inscriptions prior to the date that Nevo gives. So even though it's a sample, it still seems to be consistent.
Are any of these rock inscriptions connected to the Arabian Peninsula around Medina and Mecca?
They're, in terms of rock inscriptions.
Because wouldn't that be? Sorry, maybe if I stop moving. Wouldn't that be? Couldn't you argue that you would expect to find rock inscriptions outside of the Arabian Peninsula from people of other religious beliefs? I mean, wouldn't you expect that?
You would. So if you're asking me, were there any inscriptions found consistent with it starting in Mecca and Medina? Well, all I can say is that Nevo said that after decades of searching for any archaeological evidence around Mecca for Islam's origins there, they haven't found anything consistent with the Islamic tradition.
That's also the finding of so many other people. Like that's, it's quite weird the silence of that archaeology is pronouncing in that area of the world, given all the narratives about Mecca and Medina and the size of the civilization that was there and its importance as a place of pilgrimage and trade.
So just to give you another period, the next period is referred to as early Muslim, which is the period 776 to 787. And here we have the very first reference to a Shahada in a popular inscription. There is no God but Allah alone. He has...
What year was that, sorry?
776, 787. So very late.
Very late.
So this is like 150 years in.
By this time, the Islamic Caliphate has already taken Egypt and Syria and Palestine, and so we would expect that much earlier than this to have found some kind of inscription, some kind of evidence.
Well, the other thing to bear in mind, this is the popular inscription. So this is an example of, it gives you an idea that the religion has now filtered down to the ordinary people. I am going to refer you to the royal inscriptions, which are earlier, but the fact that the earliest ones are among the royal inscriptions indicates that the origin of Islam is with the royal leaders rather than with the popular masses. And that's key. So then so just moving on to the last period, which Neville refers to as Muslim, which is dated to 300 AH or 912 AD. That's when you find a more established theology of Islam. For example, in the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, that Allah and his angels will incline unto Muhammad and the Prophet. Allah's blessing upon Muhammad, and Basir bin Tamim wrote it. So that would give you kind of an idea of the popular inscriptions. Now, in terms of, I don't know if you wanted to ask me something, but if I were to turn to the royal inscriptions, that tells another story. So if we go to the year 678, which, you know, that would be, I would make it about 40, 50 years into Islam's beginnings, presumably. Would you be?
What
be right?
What year?
678. So it'd be 58 AH. Okay.
Right. Yep.
So this is from Muawiyah's dam, right? So this is a royal official inscription, and just read it to you. It's very telling what's in it and what isn't in it. This is the dam belonging to the servant of God, Muawiyah, commander of the faithful. Abdallah bin Saksir built it with God's permission in the year 58. Allah forgave the servant of God, Muawiyah, commander of the faithful, confirm him in his position and help him. Amir bin Habab wrote it. I think it should be obvious to everyone that what's missing is there's no mention of Muhammad. There's no mention of Islam. Or
why would there be a mention? But it's asking for God's blessing on him. Why would there be a mention of Muhammad?
Well, it's simply, if we contrast this to Abdul Malik's time, once he announces Muhammad, pretty much from then onwards, Muhammad is mentioned predominantly in those inscriptions. But for a caliph not to refer to his predecessor is odd, to say the least. And this isn't just something in isolation. When Muawiyah wrote his letter to the Byzantine emperor, calling him to worship the God of Abraham, he doesn't refer to a religion called Islam or to Muhammad either. So we see this again and again.
This is when he wrote to the emperor in Constantinople.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, so an interesting thing as well, is that this inscription was done in Taif, which is not far from Mecca. So it's unthinkable, in my view, that an inscription that's made so close to Mecca wouldn't have any reference to Muhammad.
I just want to focus in on this Muawiyah point, and maybe move the discussion in that direction. And the reason why is because I think if you are able to evidence and identify a clear pattern where Muawiyah, who is one of the very earliest caliphs of the Islamic empire, if he is not referencing Muhammad, then that definitely does present an issue. It really does present an issue. So you've given two examples: the dam, the letter. Now, I agree with you. You would expect him to go Abraham, Isa, Musa, Isa, Muhammad. You'd expect him, if Islam was the thing that emerged complete as we find it today, if it emerged at the time of Muhammad, then we would expect Muawiyah to be speaking in those terms, because that's an Islamic way of speaking as we find it today. But if he's not, and you can demonstrate more examples of where he isn't, then let's zoom in a bit more on Muawiyah then. What is the connection with Muawiyah?
Well, the key thing with Muawiyah, and actually I will come back to, I have material related to the various caliphs later that I might jump to later. But the key thing about him is that he appears from the evidence to be the first caliph. He's the first one that appears to have had control over the vast area of lands of Arabia and Syria and so on. The evidence appears to be that the chronology of the early caliphs is dodgy. There's confusion about what exactly Muawiyah's his religion is. But I would suggest, on the balance of evidence, he's probably an Abrahamist, there is, I don't know, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh yeah, I just get. There is evidence that, according to one chronicle, I think it was Sabius, when Muawiyah went to Jerusalem, he went to pray in Gethsemane, and where else? I think I can't remember the other place he went to, but it might have been the Dome of the Rock. But the idea of him praying in Gethsemane seems strangely at odds with the idea of him being a Muslim.
I think,
and then there's the issue
strangely at odds is a bit random. It's kind of like,
well,
why?
Well, it seems to suggest a devotion to Jesus. I suppose it's not entirely at odds, because yes, Muslims do have devotion to Jesus, but the idea of him going to Gethsemane suggests that he believes that Jesus was crucified, because that's the key thing about Gethsemane. It's the location where Jesus was arrested and then later crucified, and the Islamic tradition would have us believe that Jesus wasn't crucified.
Could it not be an example of supremacism?
It could be, but maybe if I hold back, there's going to be evidence I'm going to show you with the coins.
Well, I want to focus in on Muawiyah. That's where I want to go in the conversation. I want to focus in on Muawiyah. So let's talk about Muawiyah.
Okay, so there are coins during his caliphate that have Muhammad written on them, but there's a cross on them. And the problem with that, yeah, so that wouldn't, yeah. So like that, in terms of the first mention of Muhammad, in official terms, it's on a coin with a cross. And the problem as well is that the word Muhammad can be considered a title, which means the praised one. So it could simply be a reference to Jesus, particularly when you just have a cross on it, and there's no mention of a Shahada on that coin either.
Right. So what we've got is this cross and we're sure that was minted by Muawiyah. I can't even pronounce his name. Yeah. This is water, by the way, guys. I promise you, it's water. So like this is so we've got this coin. It's got Muawiyah there. He's the caliph, and then it's also got the cross.
Yeah.
And he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, and so this could be someone who's kind of leaning towards being a Christian.
It
like
could
Constantine.
Be, yeah.
Constantine,
yeah. He's calling he's calling the emperor of the Byzantine emperor to reject Jesus and to believe in the God of Abraham. So he doesn't believe in Jesus as a savior, as God's become man. He doesn't believe that, and that's clear from his letter, something I didn't remember to mention. So I would argue that while there's some elements that sound Christian, the fact that he rejects Jesus in terms of his divinity would go against that.
Is that what he's rejecting? Do we know the contents of the letter?
We do. I don't have them to hand, but I'm quite happy to post them later underneath in the comment section.
Yeah,
I don't have them to hand with me.
Yeah, do you know from memory the basic outline of the letter, the substance? If not, just post it in the comments.
I'll post it later. But the basic idea was he's calling on the emperor to reject Jesus as savior and as the God become human, and to accept the God of Abraham, which seems to be a call to Abrahamism rather than anything else, and no reference to Muhammad or Islam. But if I can jump.
Why? I mean, there's an interesting point about the coins and the cross. Then it's kind of like, why the cross on the coins? I mean, it could be a development in his own thinking, kind of like, depending on which one comes first. There could be a development.
I would suggest that the reason is that the majority of his subjects were Christians, and if he didn't have a cross, which would have been typical of Byzantine coins, the people would simply not use them, or they might rebel against him. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he approves of Christianity. It just means that he had to, and it just goes to show the weakness that was there in the early days. They weren't quite the strong They're not quite as strong, the strong caliphs that would come later, because they hadn't got a big enough following, and they didn't have a religion to join the people together yet. Because if you remember, I said that the Abrahamists were only a tiny minority in the large population, so there wasn't a strong enough hold there just yet. So it would require a state religion to bring the people together.
Let me summarize. Let me summarize my own thoughts on what you presented so far. It seems that what you're saying is that due to the influence of the various sects within the Arabian Peninsula, particularly Judaism, there was an emergent Arabian identity that was heavily influenced by Jewish monotheism, and connecting an ethnic identity towards Ismail, that then conquers large spaces of land, inspired. I mean, do you see Muhammad as a real person in all of this? Like that there was actually a prophet called Muhammad who lived, who did something, like reveal the Quran?
I do believe that some elements of it is historical. So I do believe there was a person. Muhammad was probably a title that was given to him. I've no problem with that. But a large part of the biography, as I'll talk about later, is not historically accurate.
So you think that the title? You think there was a title called Muhammad that then later became a name?
Exactly. Yeah, that seems to be the case, especially when Muhammad was used on the coin as a title, with no indication on it that it's referring to a historical person who was a prophet. And again, just to go back to rock inscriptions, indicate that the people didn't seem to know about this guy. So even if he was a real person, he didn't have that much of an impact in the early period of that history. It only seemed to be later, on the back of a cult of personality that was developed by Abd al-Malik and al-Hajjaj, that people then suddenly started to know who this Muhammad was.
And that's the Abbasid revolution, isn't it? That you're referencing there.
Well, the late Umayyad period plus the Abbasid revolution. So it's a combination.
Okay,
so it's kind of one leads into the other.
Yeah, one leads into the other. Okay, so it's an Umayyad development.
So if I could refer to another royal inscription, if I may.
Yeah, go.
So these are milestones that were found in the 690s, right? Or from the 690s. And basically there was 4 of them that were found. I think it was at the turn of the 20th century that were found. So it was just by accident. And a composite message was brought together from the 4 examples, because each of them were damaged, but they had the same sort of message in each of them. So it says simply, the servant of God, Abd al-Malik, commander of the faithful, God's love be upon him, ordered to straighten this road and to make the milestones from Damascus up to this mile. Now, what I find interesting is that as late as the 690s, there's no reference to Muhammad, and there seems to be the beginnings of the peace be upon him title that was given to Muhammad, but it was first used for Abd al-Malik.
I mean, that bit's interesting. I do find that bit interesting. Why would you give this veneration that we see given uniquely to, by later Muslims, uniquely to the prophets? Why would you see it being applied in a formal inscription, so it's a state-sanctioned inscription, to a caliph? That is strange. I do find that strange. But I'm not so bothered about the fact that Muhammad's not referenced there. Because, again, it's kind of like if you're asking God to bless someone, there's no reason to mention Muhammad. So I think you're possibly pushing too much on that. But I do find it interesting that the peace be with you reference is not being applied to a prophet, but being applied to a caliph.
Yeah.
You know.
So another one, a very famous one, obviously, is the Dome of the Rock, 692. So probably a year or two after those road inscriptions. And this is the first public announcement of the prophet. So it says, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, there is no God but Allah alone. He has no associate. Say he is Allah one, Allah indivisible. He does not beget, nor was he begotten, and no one is of equal rank with him. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. May Allah incline unto him. So there is your very first announcement of a prophet called Muhammad in 692.
And let's not forget that churches in Jerusalem were desecrated to make that building. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, it's interesting. The shape of that building, the Dome of the Rock, is octagonal, which means it's got 8 sides. And there was a church destroyed a few miles outside of Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which was also octagonal, dedicated to the seat of Mary. And so it seems like they used the church plans for that, for the Dome of the Rock, which is weird because the Dome of the Rock is actually anti-Mary, essentially, in terms of, the key message of Theotokos, Mother of God, and yet they're copying the plan of the church.
Well, there's the instruction not to be like the unbelievers as well, not to copy them, not to copy their ways, accept their architecture, accept their educational system, their administration. Anyway, so like but I mean, and also in terms of the Dome of the Rock, the sort of quotations from the Quran don't match up with the Quran that we have today either.
No, if you just give me a moment, I'll just very quickly refer to that. See, there we go. It's a pity I can't show it to you, but yeah. So if we were to look at the Dome of the Rock, you have random passages from various parts of the Quran mentioned without reference to the Quran. There's no surah numbers or anything like that. And then in between them, you have lines here and there which are not from the Quran and yet could be considered to be part of the Quran because there's nothing distinguishing them from it.
So it's
now,
kind
there's
of
this
like
couplet, for example.
So the quote, so for the quote in a line from the Quran, then there's a line not from the Quran, and then there's a line from the Quran, and the non-Quranic is embedded within the Quranic,
as if they're exactly of the same status.
Exactly. So that implies that they're quoting something that isn't our today's Quran.
Exactly. So I'll give you one example. In this couplet, part of it is found in the Quran, but the second part isn't. There is no God but Allah alone. He has no associate. Now, that together as a couplet is not found in the Quran. But there are better ones than that. Oh, yeah. And one other thing, I want to say this in passing. This Tawhid that's found in the Dome of the Rock seems to be copied from the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies, Book 16, Chapter 7 and 9, which in Greek says, Hes esten ho theos ke plen otto uk estin, which is God is one, there is no God except him. And that's from the 4th century. And I think they simply borrowed that in creating that inscription. See, a direct translation from Greek.
Yes, I think that's an interesting observation. I've often thought that the man Muhammad, the one that kind of kick-started everything off, absorbed these ideas in his interactions with Christians, and that would be evidence of him clearly absorbing something directly from Christians, because Christians were going around in the 4th century saying that, which meant that he had 200 years. If it was written, then that means it was before it, and then it's got hundreds of years to permeate before Muhammad even absorbs it, imbibes it.
Yeah, all I would say is that is quite a very particular reference that's found in the middle of, quite a big set of books. So I would think that
the culture, I'm saying it would have been imbibed in the culture, the belief systems,
It could be, and that might be the origin of it. But I'll give you another example. There's a phrase, "May Allah incline unto him." That's there in the middle of it. You don't find that in the Quran. Another one, this quote here: "Muhammad is a messenger of Allah. May Allah incline unto him and his angels and his messengers, and may peace be upon him and Allah's love." Now that sounds very Quranic, but actually you cannot find that in the Quran. And it's weird that it's not there.
Have you got a quote there that has bits that we can see is clearly in the Quran and bits that aren't, or is it all kind of not?
Yes, let me just give. Yeah, I'll give you this one here, right? So this is an example of where something that I think was originally on the rock inscription got cut in half, and only half of it went into the Quran. So I'll give you the total quote. Allah, incline unto your messenger and servant, slave, Jesus, son of Mary. Okay, that's the first bit. And let peace be upon him the day he was born, and the day he dies, and the day he shall be raised alive. I'm sure you're familiar with that one, Surah 19,
yes,
15.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now, if you go, you've heard that so many times, but if you go to Surah 19:14 in the Quran, you don't find that line before it. In fact, you have one which refers to a disobedient tyrant. In other words, it's connected with a line before it, which has nothing to do with the line after it.
And you would think if someone
Whereas
was
in the context,
you'd think if someone was creating this monument building, and they bothered to quote any part of the Quran, they'd not add, they'd make a distinction between their words, and they wouldn't infuse the two together like that in a way that would cause confusion. Because unless the idea of the Quran as this holy book had developed later, then if we assume that the vision of the Quran was the same all the way through history, that they would revere the words of the Quran in every sense like we see today, but the artifact on the Dome of the Rock seems to demonstrate either, it seems to demonstrate a different Quran, or it seems to demonstrate some lower view of the Quran.
Yeah, I would say on the plain reading of it, it would indicate to me, and maybe I'm biased, but it would indicate to me that these inscriptions can be forward.
We're all biased.
But it would indicate to me, just on plain reading of it, that this inscription can be for the Quran, simply because those two lines work together perfectly. And somehow, when it got transferred to the Quran, the subject of the sentence essentially got lost. Now, this could have happened accidentally. Maybe a piece of it got destroyed over time, or simply they wanted it to be about not about Jesus in the Quran, but maybe to make it look like it was about Muhammad. So by getting rid of that first line, you could suddenly make it look like this was actually talking about Muhammad and not about Jesus. So that's in terms of that, probably a good place maybe to go from there is maybe to look at some key dates in terms of the development of that early Islamic history.
Yeah, go on.
I'm just.
I do want to maybe come back to. Yeah, of course. I'll fill some airspace while you're doing that. I think are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. My filler is not needed.
Yeah,
go on.
I'm ready. So, question I have here is, what evidence would I expect to see if the Islamic tradition of a prophet who began Islam in the 620s were true, right?
Yes.
So what I would this is kind of bringing it back to the key point of all of this. I would expect contemporary testimonies that match the Islamic account of Muhammad and the first caliphs. I wouldn't expect them to be perfect, but they'd have to at least be consistent with that.
Like Praxeus and Celsus. Like Celsus and Jesus. Or like Josephus and Jesus. He's not a fan of Jesus. He's not particularly, but he accords with the Christian statement of it. There's a crossover. Yeah, I would agree. You would expect that.
Yeah. Another thing I would expect is clearly identifiable Islamic coins within 20 years of his death. I wouldn't expect them to be straight away, because when you start an empire, you don't immediately have the time or inclination to start minting coins, because you could just simply use them. But within 20 years, you'd expect a Shahada, maybe something that says Muhammad is a prophet. And you would expect that they would have got rid of the images as well.
Well, I just want to pause you on that, because you would expect to see the Shahada somewhere, but you can't even find it in the Quran. I've asked this question to Muslims many times. You can't even find the Shahada in the Quran. What they do is they take this passage from here and they take that passage from there and they put them together. But you can find other verses in the Quran that give essentially a creed or a statement of faith that strikes me much more like this is the Quranic Shahada than the one that Muslims actually use.
And the other thing is, the Shahada that we do have on the Dome of the Rock is a 3-part Shahada, not a 2-part one that we have today. So even that is not the same.
Yeah, Definitely, and that's pure. That's absolute. I think that's knocked out of the park. That is a development. That's a much later development within the Islamic world. You can't find it in the Quran. You don't find it in the artifacts. You don't find it in the inscriptions. It comes about in the Hadiths, and that happens much later. But carry on. Yep, I agree.
So the other evidence I would have expected is copious popular rock inscriptions that invoke Muhammad's name from his time, and as we've seen, that there is none. But if we just look very quickly at the standard chronology according to Islamic tradition, so the first 4 caliphs, so 632 to 634, we have Abu Bakr, 634 to 644 is Umar, followed by Uthman, 644 to 656, and then Ali, supposedly 656, 651. So I've done a bit of investigating to see how much of that is borne out by history, okay? So if we turn to contemporary sources, so I'm taking contemporary sources from Robert Hoyland's book, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, which is Darwin Press, 1998. You have from the Doctrina Jacobi, or Jacobi, depending on how you pronounce it, it mentions an unnamed Arabian prophet armed with a sword, alive in 634. Right? So why would that be a problem? Well, first of all, the date is wrong. So the year that he's said to be alive is 2 years after the Islamic tradition.
Says that he died.
Yes, and it doesn't even, in the Doctrina Jacobi, now it doesn't name him, which is important detail. But the fact that it says that, you know, it gives the impression that he's still alive in 634, and it's very specific, July 634. And this Doctrina Jacobi seems to have been written very close to 634. So it's one of the earliest sources we have. That goes strongly against it. And then there's another one, independent of the Doctrina Jacobi. It's called Thomas the Presbyter. Now, Thomas the Presbyter is basically a priest who wrote inside the cover of a Bible a brief record of what had happened in his time. And he mentions the battle between the Byzantines and the Tayyaye of Muhammad, east of Gaza in 634. Now, the Tayyaye, for those who don't know, is actually the tribe that Muhammad was the head of. We can see there's lots of problems with that. First of all, he's not leading the Quraysh. It's a different tribe. Okay. Both of these accounts suggest that the date of Muhammad's death is wrong. But if we think back to Abu Bakr's and Umar's caliphates, it knocks both of those dates out, because it's unthinkable that Abu Bakr was a caliph at the same time as Muhammad was still alive. So Umar would have only just begun, if at all, his caliphate later that year, and it's doubtful if he was even a caliphate in 634. It possibly was later. So that's the first problem with the chronology. So if we, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that before we move on.
Well, I mean, what it does establish, though, is that we have this Arabian warlord that is claiming that has claimed to be a prophet, that is leading Arabian conquests outside of the Arabian Peninsula. Because you said they fought the Byzantines, right?
Yeah. So there is a problem.
There is a problem, because Muhammad didn't lead any, according to official tradition, he didn't lead any campaigns outside of the Arabian Peninsula.
There's an even bigger problem as well. Something I forgot to mention is that in the Doctrina Jacobi, it actually mentions what his message was, right? So he was announcing.
That's a pretty big point, Mel, to miss. Go on.
Escape my mind. So the big message that he was announcing the advent of the Messiah, right?
Oh, wow.
So he's not claiming, according to the very early source, he's not claiming to be the last prophet. He's actually claiming to be kind of a John the Baptist character who has the keys of the kingdom, which is very like a Petrine office he's claiming for himself. And the key, and you know, Muslims might argue, oh no, this can't be true. If there's Muslims in the comment section, tell me if I'm wrong, but Caliph Umar's nickname is Al-Faruq, which means the Redeemer. So even according to the Islamic tradition, it seems to suggest that Umar was the person that Muhammad was the warm-up act for. You know, it seems a bit odd that he was called the very thing that Muhammad was claiming to be, setting the stage for. So there's that problem.
Yes, that is definitely problematic. Though, of course, you know, within Islamic doctrine, they have the belief that the Messiah is going to come back. Though, of course, that presents other problems, which is that, you know, Muhammad then is not the final prophet. But that's a slightly separate argument. But it's definitely, there's problems. You're evidencing clear problems between what we've received and what the evidence suggests. Carry on.
Yeah. So I'm going to just move on to Ali. So, you know, if you ask any Muslim, Sunni or Shia, they're pretty confident that Ali was a caliph between 656 and 651, right? Yeah. But all of this tradition is actually from about 150 years after the time of Ali. So I did a bit of digging about that to see, does it bear up with the history? And what I found was there's a Maronite chronicle from the late 7th century. So this is pretty close to the time. I'm going to read directly from it. It says AG 969-75, 658 to 64, AG 969. Muawiyah has his sister's son who Haifa killed. Ali was slain while praying at Hira. Muawiyah went down to Hira and received allegiance from all the Arab forces there. Now, the year may not have been obvious to you, but what this chronicle is saying is that Ali was killed in 658, not 661.
Interesting. Right? Yeah.
So he was only in power for at best 2 years, but it gets worse for the Islamic tradition because I found something else as well. I found this, and this is from the year 680. It's George of Rashena, and he was a Christian. Okay, so we can say maybe he has a certain Christian bias, but in the midst of referring to
no, you're thinking about these people wrong. These people are the equivalent of Josephus and Tacitus and, you know, Pliny the Younger and Julius Africanus. They are the equivalent to those. Yeah. For us, we go, well, look at these pagans that were around at the time. Obviously, Christianity had been around for a lot longer than Islam, so, you know, the Muslims would go, look at these Christians, and these Christians should be confirming the narrative, but what you're pointing at is that they don't. Carry on.
Yeah. Okay, so in the midst of a biography of Maximus, who was an important Christian figure at the time, he says the following, and what's important about this, it's an incidental, which to me strengthens the case quite a bit because he wasn't part of polemic as such. He says the following: Muawiyah made peace with the Emperor Constance. Actually, there's the guy that I'm trying to remember on. So I'll say it again. Muawiyah made peace with the Emperor Constance, having started a war with Abu Turab, the Emir of Hira, at Sifan, and defeated him. Now, that may not mean much to you, but Abu Turab is the nickname of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Right? Now, if that hasn't rung a bell with you yet, the text clearly states that he wasn't a caliph, but merely the emir of Hira at the time he was killed.
Interesting.
Right? So, in other words, he is just simply a governor of a city. He's nothing like a caliph. He doesn't have the power that later Islamic tradition says he had. He was just simply, I won't say a nobody, but and maybe he had ambitions to be a caliph.
It was
but he wasn't as powerful as the later tradition says.
Yeah, and that would be clear evidence of romanticization, which a lot of us have suspected for a long time, to be honest. But that's a very clear evidence of that point.
And the other thing, and I unfortunately didn't get a chance to look up the source here, but I know from Murad, one of the guys from my channel, he mentioned to me that he'd found a chronicle that says that there was no caliph between I think I'm trying to remember the year, 656 and 661. So that's a third confirmation of the idea that Ali wasn't even a caliph. There was no, according to one chronicle, there was no caliph during that period. So those are three indications about that particular guy.
Wow. Yeah, that's strong evidence that there's clear later romanticization being projected onto the past, but it's also clear that there's a kernel of truth, because Ali was someone who, the Shia say that he was betrayed, that he should have been caliph, sooner, and then you got the three traitors of Islam who stopped him, and so you can kind of see how a narrative has been lost somewhere, real narrative has been lost somewhere in history, and then romanticized at a later point.
And just on that, actually, this is an important point. It's something I didn't mention at the beginning, but a key thing to bear in mind is that the two regions that were important at that time were the Ghassanids on one side and the Lakhmids on the other side. The Ghassanids were in the western part of northern Arabia, and the Lakhmids were in the eastern part. And Hira was the capital of the Lakhmids. So for the first few decades, the reason for a lot of the conflict and the civil wars was simply a conflict between these two regions, right? These were the buffer zones for the Persian and Byzantine armies. So for example, the Ghassanids formerly were the soldiers for the Byzantines, and the Lakhmids worked as the soldiers for the Persians. So even after those were kicked out of their area, they still retained that conflict from earlier times that had gone on for centuries. So it's no surprise that Muawiyah, who was the ruler from Damascus, obviously a Ghassanid leader, would be in conflict with Ali, who was from Hira.
Okay. No. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but because continue with your history.
Yep. So just go back to Muawiyah. The year that he wrote the letter to the Byzantine emperor was 651. In the 640s and 650s, there's a coin with the inscription Muhammad that depicts a figure holding a cross, which I mentioned, but I wanted to give you the year. And in the 660s and 670s, there's a coin of Muawiyah himself holding a cross. And it's interesting that just merely the fact that he has an image of himself, he doesn't need to put an image of himself, but that seems to contradict the Islamic tradition. In the 660s, Sabius writes an account of Muhammad leading an army of Arabs and 12,000 Jews on an invasion of Israel. Right?
Who says this, sorry?
This is the historian Sabius.
When he was writing?
In the 660s. So that's 30 years after that.
And go on, he said who was leading an army of...
he said that Muhammad led an army of Arabs and Jews on an invasion of Israel. He mentions there were 12,000 Jews during that invasion. So that again would contradict the Islamic tradition because...
hugely.
Oh, hugely, So these are the reasons why... So you can see he goes to Israel. And here's the thing. Why did they have him dying before he went into Palestine? Because they're trying to paint him like a Moses figure who dies before reaching the promised land, and that's part of the Romanization or the romanticization of it. The story, possibly.
I want to come to the fact. I want to come to where do we get our current understanding? Because you've laid out a very strong case that we've got early, independent, non-Islamic sources that are contradicting the received narrative of Islamic history, and you've evidenced a lot of that. I know you've got a lot more material that we could dig into, and maybe we could dig into it some more at a later stage. But I think it's important now to lay out where we receive the received narrative of Islamic history, because that's very late by comparison, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let's just lay that out for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Just give me a moment. Just going to get my notes. Might be a second now.
It's okay, because I think the evidence that you have presented leaves me with the impression that what may have happened, when I say may, is that there was genuinely a prophet figure who may have been possibly called Muhammad, or that could have just been a title of him, who was an Arabian warlord that was successful, that established an Arab an Arab empire that was based upon an Arab identity and a belief in one God, which is essentially the Islamic narrative. But it was nothing like. But this was like a proto-Islam. It was like an unformed Islam. It was like a nebulous kind of jelly, and that later this crystallized into the Islam that we know today, which was much more refined, much more cultivated, much more self-aware, much more developed, much more sophisticated than anything that Muhammad gave.
Absolutely. So in terms of talking about how the later story occurred, I just want to refer to the evidence from the 8th century, which indicates that in terms of creating the biography, there was fabrication involved. And I'm taking this from Robert Hoyland's book, In God's Path. The quote is, "I spent a year sitting with Umar the first's son, Abdallah, who died in 693, said one legal scholar, and I did not hear him transmit anything from the Prophet." There's also another quote I'll just simply point out to you as well, that when we look at the location of where the Hadith writers were from, they are all from Central Asia. So, for example, Bukhari was from Uzbekistan. Muslim ibn Hajjaj was from Iran. Muhammad ibn Majah was from Iran. Suleiman was from Iran. Muhammad ibn Isa al-Salmi. Al-Tirmidhi was Uzbekistan, and so on.
And when were they writing? Yeah, we can hear you fine. When were they writing?
Yeah, just so they were writing from, let me get this right, the 9th century, the 830s onwards, and they're
really a lot later than the contemporary sources that you've quoted.
Absolutely, and you can imagine a lot later, and also if you were to look at these places on a map, you're talking about 3,000 miles away. So where are they getting these oral history from? They can't possibly get an oral history transplanted 3,000 miles over 200 years. It's just not possible.
And so whatever they're doing, detail, of the level of detail, the idea that somebody would have thought to themselves, "Oh, I need to remember how Muhammad holds his member when he goes to the loo, because someone 200 years later will need to write that down." People don't think like that,
Yeah.
It's clear that someone else later on is post hoc projecting into the past stories to justify things in their own time.
Absolutely. And there's another interesting detail about a lot of these writers, is that they all seem to, or not all of them, but a large number of them have a slavery link. In other words, they were either a captive or son of or a grandson of a captive. So, for example, Ibn Ishaq, who wrote the Sirah, he was a grandson of a captive. Muqatil ibn Suleiman, he was a captive. Let me give you another example. You probably will have heard of Abu Hanifa. He started the law school, and he was from Kabul, and he was a grandson of a captive. So,
captives or slaves?
I'm just using slave.
Yeah,
captive was just a synonym.
Let's call it what it is: slavery.
Yeah. So you have hadiths that were being created by people who shouldn't really know anything about Muhammad, because they were slaves. They hadn't any connection geographically with Arabia. I can't find one example with well, maybe Malik ibn Abbas is said to have come from Medina, but apart from him, I can't find anyone else who is actually from Arabia. But even with Malik ibn Abbas, because he's from Yathrib, there's a doubt about where exactly is meant by Yathrib. Is it the Yathrib of Arabia or another Yathrib, which is in Mesopotamia? So even there's always something dodgy about it. But in any case, even Malik ibn Anas says that emirs force people to write hadiths, right?
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. That even he says that emirs force people to write hadiths. Why did they force people to write hadiths? Because they needed a biography. They needed a collection of stories so that people would believe in Muhammad, so that they could gel their empire together around this figure.
And that was particularly true of the Abbasid. Is it Abbasid revolution? The overthrew the Umayyads, because they would have produced a lot of hadiths to justify that revolutionary movement.
Absolutely, and one of the reasons why they would have needed these hadiths is to justify their place in power. So an awful lot of the hadiths try and indicate that the Abbasids were descendants of Muhammad. So by saying that they are they're part of the family of Muhammad, that gave them, justification to be in charge.
Yeah. But
particularly where there was no obvious reason why they should be in charge.
But I can hear people screaming, yes, but the Isnad chains, and we know the biographies of the people that appeared in the Isnad chains. How would you reply to that?
Well, the key thing about the Isnad chains is the hadiths are a claim. You're expecting people to believe your story, and then to say, well, we have a chain of narrators is a bigger claim, right? And then if you say, well, we have biographies for those, again, none of this has got any evidence written down. It's purely hearsay. All you're doing is you're going from a small claim to a bigger claim to an even bigger claim, and that to me is not evidence. It's just making an even more gigantic claim.
And more interesting to draw that out. If you think like 10 names into the chain, why would somebody have thought, oh, this person is so important, I need to write a biography about this person that says at the 100-year mark after Muhammad, but before the hadith is written, and he's kind of like at that 100 waypoint, Why would somebody think, oh yeah, this guy is so important, I need to write about his story? Do you know? It just smacks you in the face of, yeah, you made that up.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, there's a huge contrast between the supposed oral tradition being passed diligently. So if you imagine someone is learning like literally thousands of lines of stories and passing it on diligently to their disciple who passes on, and yet for the first 100 years, none of them seems to have been capable of getting a rock inscription with Muhammad's name on it. That to me doesn't make sense.
Or collecting it before Bukhari, or and as we go through history, the number of hadiths increases, or the fact that the jurisprudence in the earliest part of the Islamic rule was not based upon any hadiths. It wasn't based upon, well, Muhammad did this, so this is the legal ruling. It's based on legal analogies of existing legal laws.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why were they not appealing to these traditions before? Why do the legal fiqh, why does that develop in reference to Muhammad later, as opposed to at the earliest point? It's so obviously an invention. You don't need to win me on this point. I mean, I'm utterly convinced of it myself. I don't agree with everything you've said so far, but I do agree with, at this point, like, we could talk about it. Continue anyway. More reasons where we've got our modern narrative from. So it's 200 years too late, based upon claims that are settling political arguments, settling religious arguments, and then because you've made these claims post hoc, projected them into the past, you then need to justify that through creating chains, and then you need to justify that by creating biographies about the chains. And so all of this gets invented in a period of time where we have absolute evidence that people are literally making things up on the spot. Even the caliphs are commanding for things to be made up on the spot. And then all of a sudden we're supposed to go, oh yeah, no one's making stuff up about this.
There's also there's a particular social reason for the Hadith writers to do what they were doing as well. A lot of these were Persians, or some of them were from Khorasan, which is east of Iran or Persia. And so they weren't Arabs, so they needed to raise themselves higher in the society. And one way of doing that was to be a supposed expert in the Hadiths. So if you produced thousands of these Hadiths, you were wined and dined and acclaimed as a great wise person with all these stories, and the caliphs would have paid you for your stories and so on. And you notice, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them were past slaves, so they were at the bottom, or had some connection with slavery, so they were at the bottom of the rung socially. So this was a great ladder into high society by writing these hadiths. You know?
A bit like the prosperity gospel pastors who abuse
exactly.
to get wealthy. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
we've got it in Christianity. You know, it's kind of like, it is a religious phenomenon. It happens in the church. Why wouldn't it happen in other religions?
Yeah. So the other thing I would point out, if I may, is if we look at Ibn Hisham's Sirah, and this is something that another person called Brother Rashid, perhaps some people out there will have heard of him. He appeared on David Wood recently, but a few days before he was on his show, I did a bit of research into the Sirah. And the thing that struck me after just literally an hour of just glancing through it was that he was blatantly copying elements from the Gospels. I don't know if people out there are aware of that.
Go on, tell me.
So just to give you some examples, he starts off by saying...
Yeah. For the sake of time, give me your strongest.
Well, it's in place of the search for a room in the inn in the nativity story. He has basically a search for breasts for Muhammad. So they're going from house to house looking for breasts to feed Muhammad. That's one kind of weird example. There's a reference to a star shining on the day he was born as well. There is also a reference to an ascension into heaven connected to Muhammad. There's also a reference to the transfiguration story where Muhammad goes to Jerusalem and meets Jesus and Moses and so on. So it's quite a few like that. They're really clumsy borrowings from the Gospels.
Okay, I mean that would be a separate discussion all on its own. Mel, Mel, because
one last thing, just okay.
Because we're running out of time, and I want to give the audience time to interact. I know you're absolutely bursting with information that you want to share. What I would suggest, and I will give you 5 minutes at the end or something to wrap it all up, and if you want to deliver what you think is one other really important point you want to get into, to do so. But I want to give people time to interact with you, to ask questions of us,
Absolutely, yeah.
and to talk and to do that. So I'm going to open this up, and what I would invite people to do, if you're interested in learning more about Mel's thesis, then you need to subscribe to his channel, and you need to go through it, and you need to listen. I've been fermenting my ideas while I've been listening to you and to others. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite questions. So for people that are watching, you need to put who the question is to, either to me or to Mel, and then ask your question, and I'll tap it, and it should appear on the screen. Yeah, I just want to. Yeah. So if you've got questions, guys, please put them up. Don't rush at it, because obviously if everybody does it all at the same time, then you guarantee that your question will not be asked because it will get missed. So, pace yourselves. But if there are any questions, then we'll go through them. So let's, I'll wait for some questions to come through. Go on, Mel. Just as we start to wait for people to formulate their questions or comments, is there any other like people need to hear this kind of point that you need to make? We didn't really get onto the Abbasids, unfortunately.
Not really. If I can just refer to my notes here. Well, let me see if I have it handy. So just bear with me just a second. Yeah, another detail that I didn't mention is there's some really strong evidence for a Syriac connection to the Quran. And there are lots of stories that are blatantly taken and then Islamicized for the Quran. And what's interesting is, again, one example, what they have done is they've actually brought the that's in the original into the Quran. So one classic example is the story of Abraham saved from Nimrod's fire. And that's found a number of places in the Quran, like Surah 2, 260, Surah 6, 74, 84. And the source of it is the Midrash Rabbah, or the Targum Jonathan ben Usaid from the 1st century. And here's the interesting thing, right? When it refers to Ur, it's in the original, it was a Babylonian word for city, right? It got translated into Hebrew, or transferred into Hebrew as Ur, but the Syriac translators misinterpreted that word to mean fire, right? So they thought that the word meant fire. So what does the Quran do? It refers to Abraham coming out of the fire. So that's a blatant mistake.
Yeah.
And it's a translation error. That wasn't, whoever wrote the Quran was not aware that this mistake was in the original Syriac story. They just considered this to be a great little story, but they inherited that error into the Quran.
Just let me, so I get where you see Muhammad. You see the figure, that there was a figure that later was possibly named Muhammad.
Yeah.
Where do you see the Quran in your view? Is it something that was revealed by this Arabian figure, or was it something that was revealed by this Arabian figure and then revised later, or was it something completely created later?
No, it's neither of those. It's a different explanation.
Go on.
There were texts for this Abrahamist sect from centuries past, and in fact, I think some carbon dating of texts that they believe to be the Quran predates Islam. And there were Syriac liturgy texts. Like, for example, if you look at the later surahs, you find that they're very poetic and very different from, let's say, Surah 9. And one of the interesting things as well is if we apply orthographic analysis of the Quran, which is to do with spelling, you find in the Abrahamist text, it has old spelling of certain words like Abraham. And in other parts, which I would think are translated from Syriac, they have a more up-to-date spelling. And so what's interesting, if you take a Quran, even the one that exists today, you will not find consistent spelling throughout. It's actually because it comes from different sources. So what I think what they did was they simply took these different texts, they translated Syriac stories, they took the ancient Abrahamist text and they hobbled it together, and they made a really bad job of it. And they worked on it for a number of decades in the early part of the 8th century, and they basically, by that stage, they could do no more with it, and they kind of just left it be, mistakes and all. And then over the centuries, as it was got copied, loads of different variations came in, partially because the spelling is inconsistent. There's also one little detail I just want to add as well, is there was a letter in the script, the Arabic script, which is a Nabatean script, which is called a hay, which is like a circle with a little denticle, which is like a tooth. Now, that got dropped in the Arabic alphabet and was replaced with a different type of letter. But according to Dr. Ahmed Al-Jalad, that introduced more mistakes into the Quran as scribes misinterpreted that older letter. And in some cases, they thought it was a glottal stop, which is like like muawaya has like an apostrophe, which is like a gap. So it's and then the other problem as well is the text that is translated from Syriac. The translators misinterpreted the grammar, misinterpreted the vocabulary, and they made lots of mistakes that came into the Quran as well. And
these are I'm just going to have to stop you because I want to give time for people to talk, and we've got some questions to get through. So questions are starting to come in now, I hope. So as you can see the question on the screen, yeah.
Okay, so let me just read it. Why is it that we don't find a more primitive or pure Islam preserved by the Iberian Umayyads if traditionalism is mostly the product of the Abbasids? Why did the Umayyads just go along? I suppose the reason is that none of these different groups were entirely in isolation. There was a lot of trade between the different groups, a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. And so that kind of smoothed over the differences that were there. I think that really explains it, that, you know, they were not in isolation from each other, even though they may have gone on different pathways.
Yeah, and obviously religious authority, if we're talking about a morphic phase of the development of the religion, then what you would expect to see is that as that crystallized. Still hear me?
Yep. You just broke up there for a second.
Can you still hear me? You still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. As it crystallizes and settles, then we would expect some kind of formal, crystallization along lines that everybody agrees, which is actually what we do see. Next question for both. How do we account for the advent of Mecca if it was never a trade center or city of any significance, and if Umayyads and Abbasids are from Central Asia? Now, he's asked that question to both, but to be honest, I haven't settled in my own opinion yet on this. I've heard Mel's argument. I've heard his argument for Petra. I haven't come to any conclusion, so I am still making my own mind up where I sit on this. So if you've got a settled opinion, go for it.
Yeah, well, I don't have the quote just to hand, but there is a rock inscription to do with the Masjid al-Haram, and it's dated 698. So the inscription actually says that the inscription was written in the year that the Masjid al-Haram was built. It doesn't say rebuilt, as the Islamic tradition would say, but actually built. So why did they pick that spot there? Number of reasons. It could be they wanted a virgin area to plant the whole story. They wanted an area that was unconnected to the north of Arabia, where they could plant the place of Mecca and place their prophet in that area. And then it was much easier to maintain the story. That's one possibility. Another possibility might be to do with the conflict between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. It might be that the Abbasids were trying to set up their own area of worship distinct from the Umayyads, and so they just simply picked a more southerly location. That might be the more obvious reason, maybe.
I mean, just for your information, Kevin, Dan Gibson has spent years researching this. He's got a thesis on this very thing. So I would recommend to you and to anyone else who wants, to investigate that, to go on to Dan Gibson's channel and to listen to what he's got to say, because he's got a lot to say.
I do want to say hi to Kevin, because I'm familiar with the name.
Okay, brilliant. There we got another question here. This is for you.
Okay, has he ever heard of Qus ibn Saida, the Nestorian bishop of Najran, who Muhammad regularly heard sermons from in the Umayyad market? I probably have heard it at some point, but I haven't looked into it recently.
Prophecy.
And I'm not sure what to say about it either. I don't. A lot of those sort of stories I would put in the legendary kind of bracket, to be honest.
Okay, prophecy. I mean, if you've got evidence that you can supply about that, I'm sure that Mel would like to hear your references and your sources. I certainly would. So please do share if you've got something like that. But I've never heard of that. myself. So I'm inclined to dismiss that as later Christian legend.
Yeah.
But we know from Islamic sources that Muhammad interacted with Christians. And this is my point. It's kind of like he didn't even need to read. He would have interacted with them on a regular basis. I think, and so he would have imbibed a lot of these stories, and the same with his interactions with the Jewish people as well. And
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see if there's any other questions. Yeah. Another question for you, Seth.
What exactly is the difference between the Jewish Christian sects, like say the Ebionites or the Nazarenes, and the Abrahamists? Are they the same? Well, on the face of it, they're very similar because they've got a Jewish element and they have a Christian element which doesn't believe in Jesus' divinity. But I suppose the main difference is how they were started. So essentially, the Ebionites and the Nazarenes were Jews who became believers in Jesus in terms of him as a prophet. Whereas the Abrahamists were never Jews. They simply were Arabs who interacted with Jews and said, we like your ideas, we are going to copy them. So it's quite a different type of thing. They can't really trace their origin of their beliefs back to early Judaism. It's merely they've absorbed Jewish ideas and mimicked them on the basis of a connection with Ishmael. So just on that basis, they've justified their kind of following of that set of beliefs.
And it should also just be pointed out that certainly in the case of the Ebionites, they didn't believe in the virgin birth, that they did believe in the crucifixion, and they did believe in the resurrection. Can you still hear me, Mel?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, there's sometimes very spurious attempts to connect the Ebionites to being early Muslims when their beliefs are nothing like what you would expect to believe if the Islamic telling of history was actually accurate. Another question for you, Mel.
Okay. What does he think of the historicity of the Fitna wars? Was the family of Ali based on a real family who were related to the Prophet? I do believe Ali was a real historical person. Whether he was related to the Prophet, I couldn't say. There's some evidence that I'm coming across which I'm not really at liberty yet to talk about because I have to explore it further, which would suggest that Muhammad might have come from a Mesopotamian area, which could fit nicely with Ali being connected to him as a family. But the big problem is we don't know exactly who Muhammad was. We don't have his real name. And the only thing is, if we were to look at any of the early historical records, the likelihood is the person who is Muhammad will have a different name, and we may not necessarily be able to match it up. So we'd be looking for a king of the Tayyei tribe, ideally, in a record to be able to say that, okay, that was Muhammad. But beyond that, I think a lot of the story of the family connection is legendary.
Okay, just a reminder, guys, your question needs to be directed to someone for it to be addressed. Mel, another one for you.
Yeah. Okay, so the inscriptions are varied. So a lot of the inscriptions are in Syriac, and say from the year 602, there was a strong move towards Arabic. It was like it emerged out of the ether in a sense, and maybe that was a growing sense of pride in their identity. If you go to the north of, let's say, Arabia, well into Syria, it was common to find multiple languages. So you had Greek and Syriac and Arabic, sometimes side by side in the same inscription. Now, I would also say that there were many different scripts as well. There was called a Talmud script. There was a Sabaic script, which was found in Yemen and the Hijaz. And this actually is evidence for why the Quran wasn't written down in the Hijaz, because they should have used a Sabaic script, not a Northern Arabian script. In terms of the Isa and Yeshua, There are early Bibles that Christians were using in Arabia, both before and after the time of Muhammad, which used Yeshua. So that would confirm the idea that Christians were using Yeshua and not Isa. Even after Islam popularized Isa, they still stuck with Yeshua. Excuse me. The other thing is, in terms of Isa, rock inscriptions, I was able to correspond with Dr. Al-Jalad, and he told me through an intermediary that there were 36 inscription locations with the use of Isa, and they're all found in northerly locations, so Syria, around the Petra area, and in the Transjordan area. So that's quite interesting, which would be evidence for the idea that the Quran was developed in that area rather than way down in the Hijaz. So there hasn't been any inscription of Isa way down south in the Hijaz that I'm aware of.
Am I right in think? Sorry, you mentioned. I'm pretty sure I'm right. In fact, I know I'm right. The liturgical language of the Arab Christians in this period of time would have been Syriac.
Yeah,
because that was the liturgical language of the church.
Yeah. So,
and do you know what was the what was how did in? Do you know? I mean, I don't know if you do, but do you know how they would have said the name of our Lord in Syriac? Would it have been more like Yeshua?
They would have said Yeshua. Yeah,
they would have.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the definite. So that's not even open. There's what's the name of the Gospels? The Pashida, I think it's called. Forgive me if I got it wrong. Pashita, I think it is.
Pashita, that's Ethiopian, isn't it?
I'll have to look it up, but I think it's the Pashita is the.
Oh no, it's the Syriac. Yeah, it's the Syriac. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up with something else I was reading about earlier this week.
Yeah. What's interesting? What's interesting in every case in the Quran, and this is a very strong point, for every case where religious vocabulary is used in the Quran, in every instance, it's a Syriac word, not an Arabic word. And it's been transcribed. So I'll give you some examples. Quryana is the origin for the word Quran. The sounds didn't translate straight into Arabic. So by changing the E sound to a glottal stop and changing the E sound to U sound, you get the word Quran. Salah is the Syriac word for prayer. Soma is fasting. Surat is the Syriac word on which we get surah, the chapter. The word Furqan, which is used in the Quran and is often wrongly interpreted as meaning criterion. I don't know if anyone out there is familiar with that, but actually it means redemption in the Syriac, and that means that they have distorted the meaning of it. Zakat is a Syriac word, and the word Aya is a Syriac word which means wonder, miracle. So
what's Zakat mean in Syriac?
It's same as in Arabic. It means charity. And a really obvious one for those out there who are interested in this side of thing. Chapter 52 of the Quran, Al-Tur, means nothing in Arabic. It's actually the Syriac word for mountain. The Arabic word for mountain is Jabal. So, for example, Jebel Musa is the mountain of Moses or Mount Sinai. But they didn't even translate that properly into Arabic. It was left pretty much in Syriac, and it means nothing in Arabic.
Wow. You know? Mel,
so that's I think the case for the Syriac is very strong. Sorry.
I agree, and I recognise that we probably could have continued for another 2 hours, and you would have only just finished all the evidence that you wanted to present.
Yeah.
So again, if anyone wants to dig further into Mel's ideas and arguments, then please subscribe to his channel. It's been a really fascinating conversation. You have confirmed to me something that I have suspected for a long time, which is that proto-Islam was more like a nebulous gas than a solid, and it solidified at a much later date, 200 years after the time of the man that kicked it off. Yeah, and your basic thesis, I think, is sound, which is that the received history that we have from 200 years after the events, from thousands of miles away, is contradicted by contemporary evidence, contradicted by archaeological evidence, contradicted by artifacts, even the Quran itself from those periods. So I want to thank you for taking the time, for sharing your thesis. There's nothing in what you've said that I fundamentally disagree with, actually. There's some tweaks that I'd personally come back at you at, so it'd be interesting to talk more one-to-one. We're just out of time, sadly. I think you pushed the pedal down on some points too hard that I don't think are as hard, particularly like Muhammad's name in the inscriptions things. I think the Syriac stuff and the Umayyad point is something that definitely needs, pressing down more on. I think we should obviously end as we've begun, so I'll let you choose a psalm, and then if you want to read as a psalm as we close in prayer, and then follow that by the Our Father, and then we'll call it a day. Is there anything final you want to say before you do that?
It might take me a while to get one, so what I might do, if you have a psalm handy, maybe I'd ask you to do. But I would like to finish with something that I think is really important, and that is a really important Quranic verse that's often discussed, which is Surah 4:157, and that's the one that famously denies the crucifixion of Jesus. But in the Syriac, if we go back to the Syriac of it, it actually says something very different. If I may just quote it to end. It says, "And they say we did kill the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the Messiah of Allah, what they slew and what they crucified. And to you, the women who follow Jesus at the crucifixion, he is blessed, and to them, his followers as well." So the point I'm making is that actually in the Syriac, it means the opposite to what it means in the Arabized form. And that's because of confusion about certain words in Syriac.
If indeed it is based on a Syriac text, which is it's an interesting point if it is. Anyway, I'll read a psalm. I'll let you say the Our Father, and then we'll stop. I really want to thank you, Mel, for taking the time to speak with us. This has been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed listening to you, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. So what's the name of your channel?
Sneakers Corner. And it's been a pleasure, and I do want to say something before we go on, before we move on, is I really want to thank Bala and Murad, who are the guys who work with me on the channel, without which I wouldn't know half the things I do know. And particularly Bala, the last few days, has helped me a great deal. He is a polyglot of information, the guy with 10 degrees photographic memory, and without him, I wouldn't know half the stuff I do. So thank you, Bala, and thank you, Murad.
Okay, so I'll say the psalm, and then you follow it by the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
How blessed is the one who does not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand in the pathway with sinners, or sit in the assembly of scoffers. Instead, he finds pleasure in obeying Yahweh's commands. He meditates on his commands day and night. He is like a tree planted by flowing streams. It yields its fruit at the proper time, and its leaves never fall off. He succeeds in everything he attempts. Not so with the wicked. Instead, they are like wind-driven chaff. For this reason, the wicked cannot withstand judgment, nor can sinners join the assembly of the godly. Certainly, the Lord guards the way of the godly, but the way of the wicked ends in destruction. This is the word of the Lord.
Amen. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
So I'll say in Our Father.
Mm-hmm.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Amen. Right. Good night. God bless. It's a pleasure talking to you, and let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob.
I definitely think there's another conversation to be had on this.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.